start with the final session of our seminar. As you know from yesterday, the goal is to raise some questions and topics that were presented in the lectures and discussions in the morning and in the afternoon lecture, somehow try to go deeper or further, whatever. You're also free to ask questions and to comment also on each other contributions. So for the beginning, I will start just with one question to steer up a discussion. So for the beginning, I have a question for Nikola. In the end of your lecture, you were in some way comparing the reactions or the positions of the nationalist ideologies or far-right movements in Central Visegrad countries and in ex-Yugoslav region. And you mentioned in a sense that this kind of so-called race to the bottom or making respective countries more attractive to the foreign investments is in some case is in some way it's called material basis or material source or fuel for nationalist rhetorics and politics also in Yugoslav countries. Can you explain a little bit that? Because I can see that is an element in it, but somehow it's not very easy. It's not easy to observe it in terms of like, in lack of better words, like some kind of mechanic relation between those two, because especially in Croatia, I cannot see even in nationalist, be it HDZ or more far-right rhetorics, any kind of using nationalist rhetorics as a tool or whatever to present the image of our country as more attractive for a foreign capital, let's say, instead of Serbia or whichever country. How do you? Of course, there is underlying element of this kind of positioning of the country, especially in that sense that you were when you were answering the question about the Croatian right and some projects or initiatives, especially from our president, to connect with the Visegrad countries in terms of this ideological heritage of Croatian right, that Croatia is not part of the Balkans but Central Eastern Europe. In that sense, you can find some parallels, but for me, not easily observable what these parallels of or any kind of relation between this type of development model based on attracting foreign investments and nationalist rhetorics against countries in the region, especially Serbia.
Okay, so I wouldn't really agree that there are no manifestations of this competitiveness, rhetorics of competitiveness in the local Croatian elite. I think only the other day, basically, the president said something which is actually became some sort of a slogan that she uses quite often, which goes something like, "Oh, we expected to be a successful country, but now we are overpassed," or how do you say this? Pretekli su nas.
We are surpassed.
Yes, we are somehow surpassed by the countries we thought that are far behind us. And then this statement is followed up by a suggestion which says basically, "Oh, we have to now make more radical reforms so as to to become more competitive in this regard, to be able to fight off these other countries." But of course, this is not a unique statement, not just with her. I mean, there are other statements which basically, I think, show that in this strategic thinking of the local Croatian establishment, there is this very high emphasis on competitiveness, and in the sense fear that it will be that Croatia will somehow be left behind by not being competitive enough, especially in context of this strategy of attracting foreign direct investment by low wages and miserable social security system, etc. But I mean, this is really just one of the factors, and it's not necessarily just the main factor in this anti-Serbian rhetoric, so we shouldn't overestimate it. It's not the only source of interethnic conflicts or this, how to say this, intolerance in the region. I think that nationalism generally as a concept has quite a lot of functions, quite a lot of manifestation, different sorts of manifestation, and it fulfills different roles in the concrete historical and social contexts. So it can serve also as a is a factor of social cohesion in the context of degrading social security, as I also mentioned. So yes, I mean, for sure it's much more complex, and its roles and sources are significantly more complex than just this race to the bottom issue. But I think it's important to notice that contrary to what was believed earlier, the race to the bottom in the context of joint trade of common market does not eliminate nationalist competition as was earlier believed, but actually can serve as a factor that's contributing to further development of competitive, this nationalist competitive spirit, which in turn can sometimes be translated to a sort of ethnic animosities, and especially national animosities.
Well, in that sense, it's also interesting when, especially with the present, also this kind of interventions, that you can somehow see this kind of chauvinist dimension in it. When I say even Bulgaria, Romania, and Serbia are better than us, there is dimension. There is no way they should be better because we are, whatever. It's not this kind of dimension. Is interesting. It's not there. We know we are better, and we are not providing our people or our country with the success that should be, in our hands. As such, it's so-called. It's not like how there we take our jobs, something that our investors we go there, but it's like how this is happening. That should not be happening because they are, people of, lesser entrepreneurial quality or whatever.
Okay. Just to continue in this. Okay, I will be very, very short. Yes, I mean, one of the, consequences of these expectations from the process of joining the development strategy based on, this magical or consequences of developmental consequences of joining the common market is that every single country, every single nation in this periphery of Europe expects that its rightful place is in the core of the continent and everybody else is on the periphery. So, I mean, there is also like this ideological, construct of having a rightful place in the core of the system while being on the periphery. That it's not just like a calculated competitive strategy. Okay, let's just be this much better from the others. It grows into this kind of mythologization of the rightful historical place in the heart of Europe, etc., which exists in every single country which is on the periphery of Europe.
We have two contributions.
Just one point and sort of something like a problem maybe. There is also one other usage of the concept of nationalism, at least in Serbia, but I suppose that the same thing is going on in Croatia. Actually, I'm pretty sure that there is. Nationalism as a concept, as a notion, is also used to mark some kind of division line in Serbia between first and second Serbia, concept of first and second Serbia. So the first Serbia is conservative, nationalist, and so on, and the second Serbia is sort of liberal, cosmopolitan, or whatever. So in this sense, the concept of nationalism serves also as something that sort of fills in the political sphere to some extent, and to some extent it actually is one sort of, how should I say it? It's maybe dampening some sort of political sphere where one could maybe ask some class questions or some problems about class issues. So that's one thing that I actually wanted to say. So this is like something like a problem, sort of.
So if I properly understood that you are saying that the Serbian society, as example, is politically divided in that sense that it somehow makes it impossible to intervene politically without engaging this kind of division. Not impossibly, but sort of you have this space is very narrow to put this kind of matter, because large part of political sphere, at least before 2012, for example, was actually just taken over by this identification and locating oneself according to this question of whether you are first, second Serbia, or nationalist, conservative, or liberal, whatever.
I read an article yesterday that in Croatia there is like a test you can do in like the first few weeks when a woman is pregnant, and it's really expensive and it's painful and all of those things, but you can you can see the sex of the baby before the window for the abortion ends. So you can actually abort the baby before, if it's like, you can abort the baby when you find out the sex. And the rhetoric of the text was that if the baby is female, you abort it. If it's male, you can have it because, the male dominance and everything. But that is a really radical example of this, what I want to say, and that we all know that that male dominance and how women and how we celebrate in Serbia, and I guess in Croatia as well, when a male baby is born and when a female baby is born. And Irena mentioned the church, and we all know where the church stands on abortion. So that's kind of contradictory, the two things. So maybe if you have a comment or something on that, how does the far right incorporate these two things? I don't know. Or maybe it can just be a comment. if you don't have anything to say.
That is just one of the contradictions in nationalism. I just wanted to say about the subject we talked about a minute ago. In Serbia, as well in Croatia, the main narrative, new nationalistic narrative had become how to become a regional leader in economy. So nationalism is used, instrumentalized by itself in a matter how can one nation become better than every other nation in the region. And about the abortion thing in Serbia, far-right organizations are against abortion. Point. So they don't have, I don't know, any of some exclusive statement about male or female abortion. I mean, abortion of female or male babies. But that is the part of patriarchy and not nationalism. It includes each other, of course, but there isn't any special standing for far right in Serbia about the subject.
I have to admit that I haven't seen that article, Croatia, and that I haven't detected that kind of trend. Maybe it is, of course, it is what you said about celebrating the male baby. It's, of course, the integral part of patriarchy here, but this kind of trend, especially now when the procedure for abortion is getting much more complicated. I don't know, I haven't seen this article or any kind of suggestions that this trend is now in Croatia, but maybe someone can say more about it. So just before it was because first it was Matić and then
Okay, so first of all, thank you for inspiring lectures both yesterday and today, and thanks for opening this topic of nationalism, populism, and the new right, which is a topic that I think for some time now we've been seeing it coming, but it hasn't yet been open, probably because of the fear what could be the consequences. So having that in mind, I think that this seminar really did a great job. What I wanted to comment or to ask for the comments from or to start a discussion with our lecturers that are present here is I wanted to draw upon Stefan's comment on nationalism as the demarcation line on Serbian political scene. That is the division between first and second Serbia, and just to put it in brackets, there's I've seen the third Serbia stencils, which, as I understood, are far right and nationalist groups that made it. First Serbia, in fact, in its second iteration. When we go back to the 90s, we see anti-nationalism as the liberal opposition to the authoritarian regimes of nationalist authoritarian regimes of the 90s and former Yugoslav republics, and that anti-nationalism was often formulated as some sort of European orientation. So, having in mind, in a sense, it was a vehicle of the process of European integration in
the post-Yugoslav countries. And as we all very well know, the process of European integration brought us the restoration of capitalism and all the negative social consequences. So what I would like to ask is, how do you see, what do you see as the socialist opposition to the nationalist positions of the right? And how to take a stance towards the anti-national, how to take a critical stance towards the anti-nationalist positions of the liberal oppositions to the authoritarian regimes of the 90s.
So, for sure, not maybe as pronounced as is in Serbia, but definitely there is this idea of dichotomy on the political scene or political opinions in Croatia between the so-called nationalists and the liberals. But if we are to try to understand their concrete political positions a little bit better, we will very soon find out that neither are the nationalists actually nationalists in a sense of having some specific national political projects, nor are the liberals actually anti-nationalists in the sense that they would be a sort of internationalist. So what I mean by the first instance, in specific in Croatia, what we sometimes occasionally rather generously call nationalism quite often boils down to basic anti-Serbian and of course anti-Roma, anti-Bosnian, etc. Petty chauvinism, which well, it basically boils down to to inciting or fueling hatreds to the immediate neighbors without actually having any sort of political concept of building some sort of more independent and strong nation state, which basically is what nationalism should be about. Just to give some short examples, it's like we haven't in the last 30 years we had a lot of right-wing parties and officially nationalist parties were completely dominating the political scene. And we have often heard them saying that 200,000 Serbs in Croatia, members of the ethnic minority of Serbs, present a very serious problem. But we have never heard any of these supposed nationalists to actually complain about political pressures by, for instance, the German state on the specific process of privatizations that benefited the German capital and actually harming even the Croatian capital, not to mention the Croatian workers or general society. So in this sense, I mean, this is it's a bit generous. I mean, I'm saying this half jokingly, but it's a bit generous to call them even nationalist. And I mean, in the same, and of course, I mean, on the other hand, liberals, not to be too long, liberals, I have yet to hear a coherent in this sense, anti-racist or internationalist or liberal positions from the domestic political scenes that would really present a sort of slobodarska, libertarian, not in the sense of freedom-loving or egalitarian or political project oriented toward social solidarity. So, I mean, in this sense, their differences seem to be much less than it seems on the first instance. So, what are we supposed to do? I mean, we are supposed to provide, I think, a truly egalitarian and democratic alternative to both. You know, and to do this, we have to understand their deconstruct their positions and, you know, build a better, which is at the same time egalitarian and democratic solutions to their answers to their projects.
I will just I have a very quick comment. I can't agree more about the thing that the liberals are not default anti-nationalist, but I think there is a more absurd paradox when it comes to this subject. Even nationalist and anti-nationalism, like First Serbia and Second Serbia, use the similar, I would say, the same rhetorics. For nationalists, bad Serbs are other religion, other ethnicity, and so on. And for the Second Serbia, the bad Serbs are the first one. So that is very absurd situation in I don't know, everyday politics. So they using the same position, and that is the populist position. So I think that we, in order to deconstruct them, we have to be aware of their political positions, which are very, very similar.
Yeah, I wanted to say with this argument when abortions are seen as against women because of abortion of female fetuses. It's actually in line with what you said about using human rights discourse against human rights. And it's not new, and you know, it started long time ago in US, and since Croatian and European organization on this way learn from US and are from US organization and are funded by them. It's actually very common, and I think in Croatia organizations like this are blooming and are very strong now. And also I think how they actually took this discourse of human rights in a way is left without. It's kind of, they left, we are speechless, we don't know how to answer this. And yeah, I think that is something, it should be, like we should work on it in this way.
If I can some.
Yeah, of course.
I think that the abortion of the female babies can be implemented in this narrative, how we can put women into private sphere. So if we have more male babies and tomorrow males, they go to work. They will be in the public sphere. And we need women just to, I don't know, give birth to another children. So.
And can I just add, for example, we now use like female babies. I mean, they're fetuses because they're using these unborn babies as a way to put as equal like female, like woman life and unborn babies as equal. Yeah. It's just like. Yeah.
Stefan or Stipe?
Well. Yeah, just one quick point, and that's sort of returning to this first, second Serbia. So the thing that actually reflects that the division between these two groups is actually very foggy and unclear is our current president, Aleksandar Vučić. So he was crazy nationalist guy until, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, and now he's a crazy capitalist guy. He discovered Max Weber and Protestant ethics and capitalism and production and the GDPs and all those stuff. Actually what he effectively did is take over the narrative of this second Serbia. So the second Serbia is always talking European Union, European values, sort of. And now he's taken over this. And the second Serbia doesn't have anything to talk about. So they do not have, they're deprived of their political narrative. Yeah, that's the thing. Maybe I could go deeper, but I think that there is time, so yeah.
I wanted to maybe slightly historicize or introduce a historical differentiation or distinction into what Nikola was saying about the question of the question of nationalists, whether they actually ever had a nationalist project in the proper sense, which is a legitimate question to ask, of course. And I think that from today's perspective, absolutely what you're saying is true. It is there is nothing that could be called a national development program economically or in terms of these notions that the right usually fetishizes, like national sovereignty and blah blah blah. All of this has been eroded in the context of an integration process, which, except for very fringe groups of the marginal extreme right, is not being questioned. And in terms of that Croatian nationalism is left basically with a merely a negative agenda of petty chauvinism. I would also agree on this, absolutely, as an adequate description. The one thing I would introduce is this historical reference to the strategic role of Croatian nationalism in the preceding decades. Let's say 70s, 80s, and up to the 90s. And there, anti-Serbism was not merely a petty chauvinism, but it was tied into much more elaborated ideological construction or a narrative, which did, in fact, at that point, seem like an adequate national development program or strategy. And this basically meant that anti-Serbism was tied to anti-Yugoslavism, and it was tied to anti-socialism, more or less explicitly, depending on 71 and the 80s and 90s. It differs in that sense, and all of this was also tied to a agenda of Western European integration, where cutting all institutional and cultural ties with Yugoslavia and the Balkans was the precondition of returning, as it were, in the nationalist narrative, especially under Tudjman, to where we always belong, that is Western Europe. Like, we have nothing to do with the orthodoxy and Osmanian contaminations of Serbia and the East. We are a highly developed Western European country. We belong in the Western circle of civilization, Roman Catholic, blah, blah, blah. So in that aspect, Croatian nationalism and its anti-Serb element was not merely, in that sense, irrational petty chauvinism. It had this very important strategic role of delegitimizing Yugoslavia, delegitimizing socialism, where Tudjman even went so far at one point to claim that socialist tendencies, in terms of ideological or the worldview tendencies, are foreign to the substance of the Croatian people. It is something that more properly belongs to the Byzantinian tendencies of the Serbian national essence, and is therefore a contaminant, a factor of contamination. So all of these aspects, I mean, this is something that is probably very well known within the Croatian context, but in the context of this broader debate for the people maybe in Serbia or even further abroad may not know. And I would also only add that I actually do agree that in that sense, neither were the liberals anti-nationalist in that sense. Much of what in the 90s became left liberal opposition to Tudjman's nationalism, in fact, if we look at these points, were also anti-Yugoslav, pro-Western European, pro-capitalist or anti-socialist, but they contested the political style. They didn't like the this was a more a sophisticated and more rational nationalism, like Vlado Gotovac, for example, or some other figures. On the, so nobody contested, and you can see this also there, nobody contested to Croatia to leave, the idea that Croatia should leave Yugoslavia. No one contested that it should become capitalist, and no one contested that it should be integrated into Western Europe. The left liberals were, but they were in that sense also anti-socialist or anti-Yugoslav, but not on the cultural level. Their economic and social anti-socialism and anti-Yugoslavism in terms of the trade project did not exclude a form of generous cultural nostalgia and appropriation of the Yugoslav period. And this is probably the more profound difference in terms of political style and rhetorics, and of course also in the levels of xenophobia. I mean, probably if the left liberal nationalist variant had been dominant in the 90s, probably in terms of ethnically motivated violence or the general discursive culture of that form of nationalism would have probably been different. I would speculate, but fundamentally I do agree with what you said, but just to introduce these additional arguments.
Okay, I'll just add one comment. In Serbia during the 90s, anti-Croatianism isn't that much part of the anti-Yugoslav and anti-communistic rhetoric, but the strategic way to legitimize participation in war with the states that wanted to get out. So that's the slightly difference between the anti-Serb or anti-Croats rhetorics in these two states.
Janko.
So I would like to, I really like what Luka mentioned before of how can we respond to this as a left and to think about it and debate about it. So I think that the problem of the left, of us, I don't know, me, I see it, I do it very often, and I noticed that recently, is that it doesn't matter, I'm now confused because I don't want to sound pretentious, of course. It's because not making a differentiation, clear differentiation between the theory and what we say as in public. So when we said, I don't know, should we focus so much in our agenda, in our answers? Should we focus so much on deconstructing their positions? Because what I think that emotionally the left causes to the people is that the left is anti this, anti that, and that it doesn't have a lot of solutions, and emotionally that it's that leaves a sort of pessimism when it communicates with people, because it says this the situation is like this, and it pays a lot bigger attention to the negative and to the other groups than to its concrete proposals. And what I think it's the consequence of that is that the people are not really optimistic to involve with the left, because it leaves them with that kind of position. And what I was thinking before, this might stir up. And I'm not saying that the theory is not, of course, we need to have a theory behind the praxis, but when we say, I often hear people, yes, they have some good suggestions, but they are not questioning the economic system, the concrete materialist structure, which is of course very important. But my dilemma always is when I'm thinking about it as how efficient is to do that in the public. If we say, if we talk about capitalism in the public, what I think it will cause through our audience or the people we want to attract is, the people, and we are aware pretty much that we will not, like overcome capitalism in the future, in the near future. And what I think that it leaves the impression that the people think about it, and we say, yeah, it comes from the material structure, from the capitalist structure, and in that public speech, I think that people stay pessimistic. And because we cannot, say that we will transform to socialism in a near future. So in that way, I think it leaves people pessimistic. And of course, on the other side, not mentioning that when on the Balkans, in the Balkans area, in Serbia, when you have an anti-capitalist discourse, you are immediately demonized because of a strong, as Irena and other lecturers were talking about, because of the strong revisionist process and the strong anti-communist agenda in the media. That's my comment.
Okay, I think it's an interesting question of whether just to be anti, but I think it's not easily solvable by just putting this in opposition to like making strong demarcation between being anti and making a positive program. Because, unfortunately, when we talk, we always talk in an already determined political context. And by saying something, your statement is already assessed, put into the, assessed in relations to the dominant, ideologically dominant positions, which are, speaking very broadly, already nationalist and liberal. So, quite concretely, saying something will always be interpreted in an existing context as either coming from a liberal or a nationalist side. Take any concrete social issue, and you will be faced with the same problem. So. Yes, definitely we have to provide a positive program of what it is exactly that we are trying to do. But unfortunately, in order to do that, we will have to get into the conflict with the existing hegemonical positions. And I think not only that, it's even worse, that will not be enough. I think that we often talk about speaking, presenting program, we talk about media, we talk about discourse, we talk about communicating with the public, which are all like can occasionally be part of the strategy, but I'm afraid it probably will not be enough for the strategy to change actually something. I think we have to think more about actually organizing and not just organizing in order to promote this or that idea, but organizing to, in fact, construct the alternative, to put our social, democratic and egalitarian ideas into practice, which is actually the way to build a movement. I think this is something which is rather far from the level on which we are discussing now, but it's probably inevitable if we actually want to become a factor in the political conflict. And why do we have to build our own structures? Well, unfortunately, because we don't have, we can't use the existing. They're already taken by somebody else. So, I mean, this sort of struggle is also something that's ahead of us. But of course, I mean, these are very general statements about extremely complex processes, which actually include social change and are part of a very complicated strategy, which I mean it can't be discussed in few minutes at this sort of a meeting. But yeah.
I think that critique and making a positive effort are not mutually exclusive things. I think that it doesn't exclude each other. You have to deconstruct the opponent political position parallel with the construction of your own. So I think that, like Nikola said, we, in order to deconstruct the political position of our opponent, we have to criticize, deconstruct, and do that in public, do that through the media, and do that theoretically, and I don't know, through academic knowledge and theoretical knowledge and stuff like that. So I think that strategy of the left is complex, and we can't make it here. But I think that we should all have in mind that the same time deconstruction of the right-wing politics and the construction of the left-wing politics have to be in the same time. I don't know if I'm clear enough.
Yeah, first, thank you very much for your interesting presentations. I learned a lot of new stuff I still have to process. And yeah, I was wondering a little bit the same of what to do now as a left. And yeah, sometimes I doubt too the value of all this work we put in deconstructing their positions, because in a certain way, yeah, we do live, or we have to accept the phenomenon of this post-facticism. There is this, just to give an example, yeah, in this Pegida movement I was talking about yesterday, there was an interview broadcasted in the national TV of some people demonstrating there in this movement. And they were asked, well, here in Saxony, there are only living like less than 0.1% immigrants or non-Germans. Yeah? What do you have against them? And they, well, I don't care. This was the answer. Yeah, I don't know immigrants, I don't know non-Germans, but I don't like them. This is, and what do you do with this fact? Yeah, deconstruct. There are people in this world different from you, and you can accept them. Well, this was one question. But from your actual presentations, I got the impression that the topic of the historical revisionism seems to be a pretty virulent one. I could add just shortly an experience I made in the Ukraine, where something quite the same happens, where their regional branch of interwar and even post-war fascism is rehabilitated massively on a state and social level. In Germany, we do have once in a while people denying or relativizing the Holocaust and the National Socialist regime, but they do have a hard stand for good reasons. But still, I think that, argued differently, we had a broad movement of social and educational workers, more or less, who were focusing in the last years on an educational work directed towards holding up remembrance, which I think is pretty important, not only holding it up, but holding up the moral impetus against fascism and hence the extreme right, the contemporary extreme right. And I would like to know, or maybe you can tell something, if there are any attempts here to work in this field on a broader level as just one small piece of the puzzle, what we can do. Yeah.
Okay. Well, just shortly. Okay, deconstructing was not the best best term to use in this situation, and yeah, I mean you're right. It doesn't. We don't have to how to say demonstrate the illogicness of their political discourse necessarily, because it's necessarily contradictory. But in a way, if there are thousands of people who go to Pegida rally to protest about non-existing immigrants, then it's definitely a phenomenon that's worth exploring and trying to understand. So, I mean, in that sense, we have an obligation to understand why people, especially in the East or in the Saxony, are so engaged in protests or organized against pretty much imaginary threat. So, I mean, it's an interesting phenomenon that's also dangerous but important, politically. Concerning the remembrance, okay, I think I can't now illustrate everything that's done about this fights against historical revisionism, but I think it's a rather important, actually, activity here. Maybe even at some points in time dominating, the agenda here. In terms of publishing, in terms of organizing activities, actually this idea that to remember is to struggle, is an important part of the activities, political activities here. But we can also discuss this later,
If there's 1,000 of people who are protesting against refugees or I don't know, people of different ethnical or religious belongings, because of why not, then you have to deconstruct how it's the fact that the xenophobia became socially acceptable. So you don't have to deconstruct the, I don't know, stupidity of the process. You have to deconstruct why, the reason. So if you have a guy who will say, I don't care, I'm just here because I'm against, but I don't know why, then you have to ask yourself, how did we get to the point where is xenophobia and racism so socially acceptable and with no consequences at all? And yes, what Nikola said about movements that are against rehabilitation of in Serbia ethnic movement, there are few of them. So I think that's the big deal on the left, especially.
Just to add one more comment to this question of this confused or not confused Pegida guy on the demonstrations. It seems to me that his lack of concern for the empirical evidence of reasoning for protest primarily indicates that they are missing some other kind of protests which will be more related to his empirical situation, to his everyday experience. Because if there are any other political activity or social mobilization which addresses his everyday life or his struggles with work or living on being unemployed, that any kind of attractive mobilization can do, if there is some kind of it would function it would sound a little bit functionalist, but I'm not thinking that way, to canalize that kind of political energy or political frustration. So it seems to me that that is also part that we have to you know, this Sherlock Holmes joke, why the dog didn't bark. So why there are some kind of project that would mobilize political frustrations, and maybe that's in that direction we can see the reason why he's not concerned with the empirical content. So now we have, before Stipe, we have three. First, Vlada. No, then Janko.
I just had a short comment on what Nikola responded to me, is that what you've said is that we should like more focus on our organization and on organizing our structures where I agree, where we don't have resources and structures. And I forgot to mention that earlier when I was talking about it. And yes, the left has that problem of the problem I think it has of mixing the theory and doing using that discourse in practice, because it doesn't have resources. The same people need to work in theory and to write and to be activists, and that is a big problem, and that is, I think, one of the sources of the problem. But you said, yeah, we need to focus more on that, but I don't think that those two could be separate questions, that we need to focus more on organizing and creating our structures than on the media and communicating with people. I don't think we can really organize and create structures without changing the way we communicate with people, and that, you know, we need to think about things like that now may sound clientelistic and like commercial, but I really think we need to think about things about which age groups do we address, which demographic groups we address, and to regarding that to shape our discourse.
Well, this is the third time, so if there's okay. Well, yeah. Well, this what Jan said is actually very important. Well, this field of memory is actually potentially one of the fields that left must engage in, because you know, the memory studies and this whole process of memorization is actually seen as something like a liberal field. So liberals do just this memories and remembering and sort of. But one could approach this actually from another angle. So if there's one thing that we could identify during these 2 days, is actually all these things, new right nationalism, are highly inconsistent. So you can just pour everything in them, so they can just swap their economic programs from neoliberalism to protectionism to from this, from that, and even the thing, nationalism is actually very unstable. So we don't actually know what nationalism could mean and what nation actually means at the very end. But this actually, but there is some sort of core in those notions, so we can identify it. So we seen the title of this conference, and we all thought of something very similar. When we say new right and nationalism, we think about similar things. So what is actually this core? In my personal opinion, if we're talking about this new right and new nationalism, well, it's anti-socialism. It's this politics of bringing the society back in order, or maybe bringing the society back in joint. Yeah, that's one thing. And the core in this ideology, quotation marks, is actually this field of memories. So how do we remember socialism? How do we remember, I don't know, capitalism before socialism, and this process of romanticizing capitalism before socialism, if we are talking about Eastern Europe and similar stuff. But that is actually one of the fields that left must engage in.
I don't know if too many people are waiting, so not to take too much time. But for me, I mean, this issue about organizing is perhaps the most interesting discussion that came out of it. And I just had a few further comments about Jan. When I was talking about organizing, it was a sort of a critique on how I see people in the region thinking about what the left is supposed to do. I think it's mostly focused on two things: this media presentation on one hand, and the other hand is like infiltrating, but like participating in the existing structures of power, whether it is parliaments, and regional council or stuff like this, or other types of civil society, state civil society organizations which are there infiltrated in order, to take parts of power or something like this. I think for me this is partly unusual for the strategies of the left when compared to what were the strategies done in many other countries that have somewhat a longer tradition of this type of organizing, where the preoccupation is not primarily how to participate in this or that already existing structure of state power, but it's mostly how to organize a parallel one which can have a greater impact on the everyday social organizing of the people than the official one. It's often not so much how will we present ourselves to be more convincing in the official media, but it's often what will we do in a specific neighborhood that will present a much stronger message to the people we are engaging in than just seeing it on television or something like this. Of course, I'm primarily talking here about experiences from countries that have, countries like Spain and Turkey, that have a very, very long tradition of left-wing and socialist organizing in an extremely repressive context, and in a context where the state has basically left behind a huge part of the population and huge part of territory. And in this context, self-organization by the socialist movement has in fact proved to be an important, more important part of the social life of the neighborhood, town, etc., and has in fact gained power by replacing some of the functions that were originally intended to be fulfilled by the state. Not every country is in this sense the same, but I think we are in a sense unique here that actually nobody has seriously thought about the strategy of actually constructing an alternative power structure. Nobody has seriously implemented that, and I think in this sense, this strategy of trying to replicate the dominant political forces, the bourgeois parties, which present themselves in the official state structures and through the media, media presentation, seems maybe at first instance to be an easier path, but I think it has very, very limited chances of success in the long term. So that doesn't mean, nothing of this should be done. We shouldn't plan your media strategy. I don't think that means that, but just not to limit our focus basically just on, how you present yourself in the official media, especially if presenting your message, if it's anti-systemic message, presenting your message can be immensely more effective if it's presented by direct contact and by direct engagement in a social struggle, Just talking about it in a tele can have much less effect, at least generally, speaking, much less effect than actually engaging somebody in a discussion, joint struggle on a social issue.
despite the fact we are having here two parallel, I don't know, theses and discussions. Yeah, just to reply to Stefan, I think that anti-socialism and anti-communism is a big part of the nationalistic ideology, but. Especially here in this region and the ex-Yugoslav successor states. But one of the main demands of the nationalism is matching the ethnic and the national, or state borders. So that can mean a lot of things through the imperialistic rhetoric and aggressive foreign politics, through the, war or genocide. So I wouldn't say that anti-socialism is essential part of the nationalistic ideology.
Ja se sad prije.
To get back to the other parallel discussion. And,
the third one.
I just have to answer to Janko about the structure and the organizing, because we have two examples of how structure is actually very important for organizing. We had the protests that were known as student protests after the elections, and they had a massive potential to mobilize a lot of people, and they did at some point, but without structure, without a plan, without anything, it just fell apart. And it kind of gave us a few groups that are doing something now, but it's also very not structured, and it's a question of how long that's going to last and how much impact it's going to have actually. And the other one is Nedavimo Zagreb, which had also in the last 2 years, I think, they had also mobilized a lot of people. I mean, it was really, the protests were massive. Then now we see everything kind of crumbling down, and now it's a question of where that's going to go as well, because I don't think they're trying to make a structure and they're trying to make a political plan and everything. But now it's a question of if that's going to work and how is it going to work and everything. So, because they're not really detailed and all of that. They're not precise. So I think, yeah, that's my answer to it. And we had that discussion before. We can have it after as well.
I'll continue with the fourth stream of discussion, but I believe collectively we're capable of counting to four. So to return to the Pegida guy, and Marko has offered some sort of, I would guess, a placeholder theory. In lack of other mobilizations, anti-immigrant, the thing is maybe good enough. Okay, maybe. I would maybe suggest one thing which is symptomatic for us on the left here. So for 2 days, we're now discussing nationalism as the central category, and now faced with the problem of this apparent irrationality or post-facticity, or however you want to call it, this empirical absurdity of someone demonstrating against something which is not his immediate empirical reality in Saxony. We forget the central mediating category of his own, for him explaining his own experience, which is the nation. So the relation to one's own, in this case, I would say, argue, or to phrase it another way, one way to understand this, to not say simply from a leftist, oh, this is absurd and irrational, is to say maybe he's responding to his immediate situation, social or economic, not in terms of what is the mediating category, and it is the nation, insofar as he, of course, perceives himself as part of a nationalist we, which is ethnically and culturally defined in one way or another, and insofar as in the public domain there is this discussion of the influx of the foreign element into our nation, and the question of the distribution of resources for that. And Angela Merkel says we can accommodate 1 million refugees, but earlier, as Johan Becker has emphasized earlier, the discourse of the political mainstream was always we cannot finance social programs, this and that, and people in the East have witnessed institutional destitution and so on, and the decline. It is not necessarily so absurd, because if we introduce this mediating category of the nation and assume a subject that feels interpolated, that feels, yes, the destiny of the nation is my destiny as well. Well, this is the performative effect of nationalism as a historical reality. This is how people relate to their own circumstances in translating their own situation and trying to map it through categories such as the nation, as through this nationalist we of one form or another. And if the left only points out the irrationality of this, then it alienates itself from the experience of such people and potentially puts itself in the position of an elitist, of an elitist mocking, like about the absurdity, irrationality, post-facticity, and so on. We have to assume that the nation as a mediating category, as a framework of interpreting social reality and economic reality, is a historical fact that is deeply anchored, and the media sphere also reproduces this. We talked about this yesterday. If you look about, we will talk about Europe and blah 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 as an alternative, but there is no European public sphere. One thing that all of us experienced in former Yugoslavia, how the imaginary of our geographic imaginary of what became relevant, what is inside and outside, changed insofar as the Croatian media focused on what is happening within the administrative boundaries of Croatia. This is the new we, this is our new territory. Everything that was yesterday part of this our imaginary geography in Yugoslavia, Serbia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, and so on, simply dropped out. This is erased from view, and that this type of course, public sphere and so reinstates this spontaneous nationalism, which is methodological. You don't have to be an explicitly political nationalist to be thinking in a form of methodological nationalism. If you discuss, our situation, we all say our situation in Croatia, and this reflects a certain historical reality. And also, the Pegida guy, let's give him credit and assume that he's not completely irrational, but that what we can see there is, yes, the effects nationalism produces in everyday life, and social experience can and will be mediated often through that framework. It is our task to show that the conclusions, the xenophobic conclusions, are the wrong response to a maybe adequate social question. And this is, of course, the question of organization and blah, blah, blah.
Janko, you wanted to respond?
Well, nothing really. I mean, just to finish this, what we were talking, of course, that I required and I implicitly thought about all the things you mentioned, and to make it short, my only, point was that I think we should pay more attention to this with, of course, a big regard to the important things you were talking. That's it.
Okay, I will just add one more, not a line of debate, but maybe to include different, to integrate the different aspects of previous debate, especially it was concerning the role, this role that Stipe you were talking about the Yugoslav legacy in the role of Yugoslav legacy in constructing contemporary political profiles and programs and rhetorics, and also in terms of what was Jan asking about historical revisionism and how to the fight that goes on in the so-called field of remembrance. It seems to me that it's important to put it on a little bit abstract level, not in terms that I'm debating anything said in our discussion, to acknowledge that this parallel influences, let's say, of economics to the political and ideological sphere are not every time happening, in a so-called in a real time. Okay, we have now this this strategy of development strategy of attracting foreign investors, and there should be some kind of immediate nationalist or liberal response to it, that we can see some kind of mechanical line. Now this is not, it does not to be mechanical, but you can see somehow responses to that situation. I think that it's important to acknowledge that the nationalist or any kind of ideological responses that were formed in a period of some previous crisis are still relevant, not in terms that people remember that kind of reaction, but they are somehow embedded in institutions that deal with the ways how we experience different economic crises today. I think that is most visible in a sense that in an example that was really obvious in last few years with the so-called new rise of Croatian right, or different names are circulating in trying to depict the new dynamics in Croatian political scene in the last few years. But in a sense, we can see, especially some far-right circles, is you can see that they somehow can detect or register the class, the social polarization in a society, some kind of class dynamics. But as you said, you both said, they are not they're not any way articulated in a sense, be it, foreign capital against Croatian workers, or any kind of that articulation that have any kind of resemblance to this structural class dichotomy. But in a sense, the integration into EU, it's tried to articulate it with the social and economic consequences of it. It's tried to be articulated through the class division, in a sense imagined, but not completely out of the historical reality. The class divisions of the Yugoslav society, in terms that from the Croatian far right, if they have any kind of translation of social polarization of class or class distinction, is between the so-called Yugoslav elites that now are still controlling the situation, be it in culture, media, or security apparatus, and the Croatian folk or Croatian people. You can see somehow there is urge to articulate social polarization, but it's articulated in a completely historically outdated concepts, because of course there is some kind of historical truth that especially Yugoslavia was of course class society, and these class divisions in Yugoslavia were obvious, especially in the 70s and the 80s with the crisis going on. But now, because of these nationalist programmers or theoreticians, or how to call them, they cannot apply any kind of not only analytical, any kind of apparatus. They don't use any kind of apparatus that they can apply to the current situation. And of course, it is ideologically non-appropriate for them to use some categories which are from the part of the leftist analytical tradition. So they go to different approaches to try to understand or to present the current situation. But I think that what we must learn from these, and although also there are some other currents in Croatian political situation, they also, in a sense, address the social polarization and class issues, be it through, the Živi Zid, I know the translations, Human Shield, or other currents, also somehow addressing social polarization and class structure of society, but of course without any kind of analytically so-called acceptable way. So I think that we should, in lots of these ideological trends, recognize the need or urge to address social concerns which are sometimes economic, but the outlooks, the frameworks that are used are really arbitrary. Of course, not completely arbitrary, but they are picking it up from, be it conspiracy theories of contemporary world, be it conspiracy theories of the historical reality. So I think that what makes these political positions convincing to lots of people is that they are in a weird way, we can not weird way, but in a weird way, they address social questions indirectly, but they address it in some way. They are bit with the human shield, with the bankers, elites, and whatever. Bit here with the Yugoslav elites. So they are trying to translate the class polarization in society without talking about capital and labor, in a sense, in a class, because it's in terms of this anti-communism, it's somehow forbidden world. But if you read everyday Portal's newspaper, you can see this recognition of the social polarization in every perspective in the Croatian, especially when we talk about demographic situation and the poor people going out of the country. So it's there, but no one wants to address it in terms of class. So if there's no more interventions, I think we can finish our two-day seminar. Of course, we want to thank you a lot for your participation and contribution. We also want to thank to our founders, Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung from Belgrade, and hope to see you again.
And for those from Zagreb, already next week we will continue with the same subject matter with two lectures, one by Alexander Matković and one by Madeleine Nikolova. Will be both on the same day. Already tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, you will have some form of Facebook event, which seems to be now the dominant form of, well, political communication for some of us.
So thank you once again.